Hello, welcome to another SonicLAB. That is the Arturia BeatStep Pro. You've probably seen a little bit about this already, or quite a lot actually. We did this fantastic presentation with Alex from Source, who are the UK distributors. And now I've got my very own here to play with, which is what I've been doing. In fact, what I've got here is Simmons SDS8, which is providing the drums, Boomstar SE80, which is providing the bass line, and the Dreadbox Erebus, which is providing the top line. So there's been a lot of hoo-ha about the Arturia BeatStep Pro since it was first announced. It's been taking a little time to get here, but now it's here. Here it is, and it is a lovely thing. It takes the form factor of the original BeatStep and adds it. If you weren't already aware, I'll just give you a quick recap. We've got 3 sequencer channels. We've got CV and gate 1, CV and gate 2, and then an 8-gate drum sequencer, which you program across these pads. Additional pads can also output over MIDI. In fact, this all can output over MIDI as well, so you can create some quite big multi-voice drum patterns. And I've been playing with it for a little while. In fact, it's been really hard to get on with this review because every time I start going off, I'm sort of noodling endlessly, which is what this thing kind of really does encourage. It's surprisingly solid. It's got quite a lot of mass to it, which makes it feel like it's actually kind of should be more expensive than what it costs. In fact, I may as well say this now. I think street price is about 189 quid. Just to reiterate, as well as the 3 channels of sequencing, because we've got CV and gate out and velocity out for this, CV and gate out velocity for the yellow one, and then the drum trigger outputs. We've also got a controller mode, which allows us to turn the entire surface into MIDI controller. This can be just CCs, which we've got here, or we can press the knobs into Mackie Huey mode, and that turns this part of the unit into this be level, pan, this is mute, track mute and solo. So we've got an additional kind of mode here which gives it full controller mode. Additionally, when we're in controller mode, we can actually change the behavior of these pads to be controller or note on, note off, or toggle controller on, control off. So we do get quite a lot of additional stuff. This all has to be configured in the actual MIDI command center for BeatStep Pro. This is it here. This is running on Mac OS X. It also runs on Windows. So it allows us to configure it in a great number of ways. So, you know, outside of just the straight sequencing system, we've also got a lot of other things. Let's just take a look at the panel connection as well. We've got an on-off switch. We've got the USB connection, which is micro USB, comes with a lead, and this transmits both power and MIDI data. Then we've got MIDI in and out. You get these little adapters, which are like DIN, mini DIN connectors. You get 2 of those. Then you've got clock in and out, which can be set to pulse or DIN sync. Once again, you get another adapter which allows you to hook this up. This is the one with the black lead to your maybe your 808 or your 303, or it can just be regular pulses. You've got that in and out, so you can set syncs in various different ways. Then we've got the individual pad outputs, which are the gate outputs, which can be set to positive and negative polarity, V-trig or S-trig format. Then at this end, we've got the CV outputs. We've got 2 channels of these. Sequencer 1, obviously the green one. We've got pitch to CV, which can be hertz, volts, or volt per octave. So you can run different standards of Eurorack gear. And then you've got velocity output, which is another CV output, not as accurate as this one. And that can send out velocity data for each sequence. So it's like another channel, effectively. Then you've got the gate output, which again can be set to trigger polarity. These sequencer outputs also can be set to transmit on MIDI channels, which again can go out via the MIDI output, or you can send MIDI over USB as well. So with all those clocking possibilities, you're going to need to set your sources. So as we can see here, we've got a sync button which allows us to be internal, USB, so you can receive clock over USB from your host DAW if you're running it in that mode, MIDI input, or the clock input. So you've got quite a number of clocking potential there, which means you can run this as the heart of the system or ancillary to the system, or maybe run a couple of them together. You could send clock out and be clocking from a second BeatStep Pro. So you could set up a pretty major sequencing system if you really wanted to do that. So more on the actual sequencer itself. The sequencer basically is a 16-step sequencer, but it is possible using these buttons here to basically change to change the length of the number of steps. So we've got 16, 32, 48, 64. So that's up to 4 bars if you're running in 16ths. And simply do that, you just press the last step button, and then this step will change to the last step. If you want to go to a 4-bar pattern, you just go to last step and then press the last step. In this one, I'm at a 2-bar pattern, so that basically works that way. The other thing that I can do is if I just turn these down, you'll be able to see if I press both of these cursor keys, you can see here, they both light up. And now when I play, it will jump between the number of bars, so I can always see where I am in a pattern, which is quite useful. Not all sequencers do that, so that's actually quite an extra useful feature. Another thing that's also worth mentioning when we're into the step mode is if I press play, I've just got this bass line, I press shift, and you can see here that I'm in 8's time. So I can actually set the resolution of the sequence to be 8s, 16s, 32s, or quarter notes. So I could have a kind of 4-bar 16 part, I could have a 4-bar quarter note part, or a 2-bar or a 1-bar or a 1-step. So I can create those kind of concentric cycles of rhythms, which are really, really neat. Now, a word about memory structure. The BeatStep Pro works in projects. You press the project button, you've got up to 16 projects here, which you select from pressing the project button and then selecting a project. Additionally, if you want to save a project, you press and save, press and hold, and the project will save in that location. Each project also contains 16 patterns per track. So there are 16 patterns that you can have on each track. You can have it so that they tie if I change presets, then they will all change together, or I can have them changing separately, which lets me mix things up an awful lot. Now, this is something that really caught me out. To save a sequence, if I press and hold the track, then I press the save button, then I select any one of these patterns to save the sequencer in. Now, one thing that I did notice on this, certainly, if I just play the sequence here and I save my project, I do get a little bit of pause in playback. It seems to affect the CV and gate, the voltage-based outputs, as opposed to MIDI. Storing individual patterns with a track, you don't get that jump. So it's possible to create a pattern on the fly, copy it, and keep working without any interruption in workflow. Now, about those CV outputs, I mean, the thing that's quite interesting about this is that even though it's only getting 5 volts via USB, it can still send a full 10 volt range across 2 CV sequences, and also the gate output is plenty high enough to drive pretty much any kind of gate input. In fact, the original BeatStep just didn't have quite enough juice to drive things like ARPs or whatever, which have a higher gate input. That's been fixed in this. I don't know how they do that, because it seems kind of crazy that the amount of voltage going out is greater than the voltage coming in, but I'm sure the wizards in electronics will tell me how that's done. Now, another neat feature is the ability to add swing to individual tracks. So if I now press play on my little drum track, which is straight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the swing button, which that affects the currently selected tracks. Now I can dial in as much swing, you can see I didn't quite read that, as swing written there. I can dial that in right up to 75%. Let's just add sort of 56, 55%. Come back out, let's add. We'll go to this one, and now add 56. Now I've got swing on both of these tracks. Right, so I've got this rather derivative, let's call it techno track for now. I'm going to use that to demonstrate how we deal with the velocity track. So I'm taking the velocity output of sequence, the yellow sequence, which is the 303 style thing, and I'm going to plug that into the VCF of the error bus. So now if I just mute this track, what I'm going to do also is I'm just going to limit the steps to the first 4 of the sequencer. So now what I have to do is I make sure that my knobs are in velocity mode. So now The knobs basically are directly affecting the filter cutoff of the track. Now, if I mute this and I come back and change my knobs to gate mode, so now I can turn them all right down. So now they become so I can adjust the gate length of each individual note going out. But I can also take it right up. There's a tie mode, which I'm not quite sure how that works because it doesn't seem to sound. I would have thought that this would tie this to the next note. Basically, if I mute the second step, it ties it to that, so that's how that works. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it into slide mode, which is and that gives me this kind of 303 style kind of portamento. So you get that kind of vibe going on, and it enables you to obviously modulate certain frequencies with velocity and then get that little slide thing if you're after that sort of 303. The only thing is velocity cannot be transmitted unless there is a note on that event as well. It's not possible to switch on an event without a note as far as I can tell. So you can't have like a cheeky little third track on the sequencer. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. While we're on this section, we should also take a look at the probability. I'm just going to play the drum track. What that allows me to do is press the current track. I can adjust the probability of randomness and the amount of randomness. So switch it on, probability or the randomness will be high. I'll take the probability up and it just starts to sort of auto generate a kind of randomness, and you can work this on all of the individual sequences to get some kind of variations in your work, and you can switch it straight off again to go back to your original pattern. There's also quite a lot more that you can do in terms of performance control. If I come here, I've got a triplet fill pattern. I managed to achieve this, but if I take the drum track, I've enabled the triplet knob, and I've also got my last step as 12. So we've got a kind of sort of triplet feel to it. So and now I can bring it in the looper aspect, which allows me to kind of rolling looper sort of breakpoint, but it allows me to interrupt the pattern without kind of affecting the timing. Additionally, we can affect the way that the sequencer plays back by pressing the shift button here. I go forward, I can reverse it, so it'll just play in reverse. It's a bit odd. Or I can have it alternating. So now it will just go round the pattern and back again the other way when it gets to the end. Now this brings up another interesting point, which allows me to transpose individual patterns. I press and hold the sequence button and then it brings up the keyboard again. And I can real-time transpose, and I can actually take this up or shift octaves. By pressing this transpose link button, now that means that if I transpose any sequence, I can transpose whole thing. And things like that are really useful. Incidentally, when you're storing patches, the transposition and the last step are all stored within the project and within the pattern, so you can actually recall things the way that you want them to be. So now let's take a look at the MIDI control center, which is the thing that communicates directly with the BeatStep Pro and allows you to save patches and all the various different setup options. So this is the control center. This is working on my laptop. It's OS X. It's also available for Windows. We've got all the device settings that we can set here, which is the individual channels for the sequencers. We can set individual channels for each of the sequencers and the drums. We can also set whether we want Mackie MCU mode or Huey mode when we're in controller mode. That's the thing that we set when we press the red button here, which turns this into a control surface. We can set the formats of the sequencers, whether it's volt per octave or hertz volts. We can also set the sequencer 0 volt MIDI note, which sometimes I found that the analog synths were playing a couple of octaves out, and we can set the offset here. What we can't unfortunately do though is set the scaling of the CV. Now, for instance, with the Boomstar, the CV output just wasn't quite on, you know, so an octave wasn't quite an octave, which means I had to tinker with this. What I ended up doing is running it over MIDI. It would have been nice in the this software if we could actually adjust the scaling to suit some of these analog synths, because, you know, some of them are a bit out and they just need a little bit of work. When you're dealing with MIDI to CV interfaces, quite often they've got parameters for just tinkering with that, so an octave or 2 octaves scales nicely. We've got all the clocking possibilities, so we can set the clock in-out settings to pulses per quarter note. We can also set a metronome, which is kind of handy. Send that over MIDI because there is no metronome, even though this light here does flash on the unit. It's quite hard maybe to get you when there's nothing there in the first place. Setting the drum map, we can set individual notes for the drum map. What we can't do is set MIDI channels for the pads, which is, I would like to have individual MIDI pads per individual MIDI channels per pad. That would have been useful. There's a whole ton of stuff in here. Another thing that we can do is we can bring in sequence data. So for instance, if I take my drum track here, this is a representation of what's happening on the drum patterns. If I felt like I just wanted to work in the box, same with the sequencers. I've got the sequence data here, so if I'm more comfortable editing in grid, I can, and I've got access to all of the individual parts here. When we come to the controller map, this is what happens when we're set, I said in MIDI controller mode. We can set the pads to be CC, MIDI note, program change. One thing that is quite interesting is in controller mode, the pads do not send pressure. They only send pressure when you have a sequence selected. So for instance, in control mode, these would just be sending either control on or off. We can set them toggle or momentary. But in sequencer mode, if I press, that is actually transmitting aftertouch. There's no way of getting aftertouch out of the unit other than over MIDI or over USB though. Knobs can be set to be program change, LSB, bank, so we've got plenty of options here, and we can say which ports we want these to go out as well as the pads too. We can't set the transport control or any custom functions for this side of it, but it allows us to set this up as we see fit. Patches can be stored and saved using the project browser, saved on your local system and then retransmitted, so you've got a backup of the stuff if you want it. You can also update the firmware from this. This will get squirted down via USB. It's quite a seamless operation. You just sort of, it deals with it. You don't have to find the firmware file. It will just handle it all in-house if you like. So that is the Arturia BeatStep Pro. There is a lot of stuff here, as you can see. I mean, even if you were just to buy it as a sequencer to control some analog gear, pretty cool. We've got all of that capability, but the fact that we've got the additional MIDI command control center to mix and match other systems as well and work within the DAW is pretty neat. One thing I did notice is if you're in controller mode and maybe you've got yourself set up so you've got certain levels and certain what have you sorted, when those values are not stored with a project. So if you save it in a project, this is a kind of separate layer. It's a sort of volatile layer, I suppose. So that's something that perhaps would be cool if they could introduce that, but unfortunately that's not the case. So really it comes down to, is it worthwhile? I mean, to be honest, it's almost impossible to say there's anything wrong with this at the price. Like I say, it's around 150, 160 pounds, which when I heard the price, I was actually quite surprised. I thought it would be more expensive. And considering everything that it does, it's kind of no-brainer if you're into this kind of whole step sequence mode. And perhaps if you've just got a modular system, you're thinking about buying a sequencer that went in the rack, this is a great alternative because it can control all of those things. So that's the Arturia BeatStep Pro. Gets a thumbs up from me. At this price, it's really hard to argue against it. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you want to see more of our content, just subscribe to our YouTube channel. See you later.